Chapter 37. David von Erich. One day in February, our phone rang at about 9 a.m. My wife answered the phone, and when she woke me up and told me I had to take the call, I knew it couldn't be good. I picked up the phone, and it was Bill Apter. "Did you hear the news?" he asked. David von Erich was found dead in Japan. Hearing those words was like somebody hitting me in the heart with a hammer. I literally went into a daze. I was so devastated that I just could not bring myself to call Fritz and Doris with my condolences, so I asked my wife to do it. It was just too much for me to handle. She called them, and even though Fritz was not one of my favorite people, I was able to get on the phone with him and offer my condolences. It was a horrendous time. A few days later, Jimmy Crockett called me and said, "Rick and I and my two brothers are flying to Dallas for the funeral. We saved a seat on the Learjet for you." I thanked Jimmy, but told him that I was too devastated, and that it would be too hard for me to go to David's funeral. I just couldn't go. Sometime later, Branko Lubitsch called and asked if the Great Kabuki and I would make a special appearance at the David von Erich Memorial Card on May 6th in Texas Stadium. I told him that I had to get Jimmy Crockett's approval before I committed, because I was working for him. Jimmy gave me his blessings, though, because he was also sending Ric Flair in to work on the card. There were 44,000 people at Texas Stadium that day, all of them affected by David's death. Even though it was the biggest house in the history of the Dallas booking office, I was not in a festive or jovial mood that day. To me, it was all sad. I felt the concept of a memorial card was a nice gesture, but I was uncomfortable with certain things. I noticed that Fritz had doubled the ticket prices and raised the prices of David's pictures that day. It almost seemed as if he was taking advantage of David's death for financial gain, although I knew how much he loved David. I tried to avoid being around Fritz as much as possible while in the dressing room. I don't know if I was still angry at him for the awful way things ended between us, or if I just couldn't look at him knowing his son was dead. We did say hello, but it wasn't like it used to be. It was totally different, and I was probably standoffish, but more out of not wanting to get into a conversation and emotionally involved with David's death. At one point Fritz asked me, "What do you think of Kerry getting the world title today?" I actually didn't even know Kerry was scheduled to win it from Rick that night, and asked how long he would have the belt for. 18 days. Fritz replied. "That's the worst thing you can do to him," I said. Fritz got upset with me for saying that and snapped, "You'll never change, will you?" That was my honest opinion, though. I didn't see the point, after all these years, for Kerry to finally win the title at David's Memorial, and then go to Japan and lose it a couple of weeks later. I thought an hour Broadway between the two of them would have been just fine, but that's me. People have said that David von Erich could have been world champion had he lived, but that can only be speculated upon, because he was never promised anything. I have even heard stories about how David was scheduled to win it from Ric Flair in 1983, but that Harley Race took the belt instead, leaving David out in the cold. That story is utterly ridiculous. No one was ever promised the NWA title, and Harley didn't sabotage anything. Harley's big ambition was to become world champion more times than Lou Thez. Lou had it 3 times, so Harley won it 8 times. Of course, then Rick's main goal in life was to have it more than Harley, so Rick won the NWA title 10 times. However, by doing that, it made them less of a champion than Lou Thez was, not more. I brought my family to the memorial show, because we were going to spend that week in Dallas visiting relatives. That led to the one good thing that happened to me that day: I got to see my boy Gino Hernandez again. He had finally jumped ship from Joe Blanchard's promotion and returned to the Texas booking office, and Jason and Chad found him and brought him over to me, screaming, "Hey Dad, look who we found." The Great Kabuki was scheduled to face Kamala, managed by General Skander Akbar. As the Great Kabuki and I came out of the tunnel at Texas Stadium, the fans started jumping, cheering, and carrying on. They were so overwrought with emotion for losing David, that seeing me and the Great Kabuki, because we had been gone for so long, must have touched something nostalgic in them for the good old days gone by, and they gave us the hero's welcome. It was obvious that the Great Kabuki and I were going to be the fan favorites that day, so as I was taking the Great Kabuki's outfit off, I whispered, "Don't fight it. Just lay back and let Kamala be the heel. The people want us to be good guys today." Not only were the Great Kabuki and I booked for the memorial show, but we were also promised a win on world-class championship wrestling, as well. When the Great Kabuki and I showed up at the Sportatorium on Friday, I was greeted by the man who replaced me as booker for Texas, Ken Mantell. Ken Mantell was a mediocre wrestler who had a short career in Los Angeles and Oklahoma, and his claim to fame was that he once held the junior heavyweight title. He mostly had an unillustrious in-ring career, though, and I would know, because I had used him when I had the book in Georgia. During that time he told me that he had always wanted to get into promoting, so that's what Fritz and I hired him for in the first place, to promote some spot shows in Texas. He and Fritz became good friends, and during the early 80s Ken would often go to Fritz's house and socialize with him. Ken was simply in the right place at the right time though, because, without any formal training or serving as an assistant, Fritz made him his booker when I left Texas in 1983. After a cordial greeting, Ken gave me his idea for the Great Kabuki's match that night by saying, "It's going to be the Fabulous Freebirds against Kamala, the Missing Link, and the Great Kabuki, and the Great Kabuki will lose the fall." Kamala and the Great Kabuki just wrestled each other at David's memorial, I reminded him. Now you want them to be tag team partners? On top of that, we were promised a win tonight, and now you're telling me that you want the Great Kabuki to drop the fall. No, Ken, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Ken insisted that this was the match he wanted, so I reiterated my stance by saying, Skander Akbar and I were just in a big fist fight at Texas Stadium, and now we're supposed to stand in the corner together and watch my guy get beat. There is no way this will happen. Well, you guys are from the Carolinas, Ken argued, so it doesn't really matter if the Great Kabuki gets pinned. World-class championship wrestling plays in the Carolinas, I pointed out. So I'm nicely telling you no, we won't do it. What if Killer Khan runs in and attacks the Great Kabuki so Michael Hayes can cover him? At that point I got in Ken's face and said, "What part of no don't you understand? We're not doing it." Now I don't want you to think I was acting like a big shot who refused to do jobs, or that I acted out of arrogance or anger, and that it was just sour grapes on my part. It's actually quite the contrary. When the Great Kabuki and I went to Texas for the week, we were with Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, so Jimmy Crockett was loaning us out for those shows. We went with his graces, and he had my assurance that we would do the right thing for business. Jimmy Crockett had time and money invested in us in the Carolinas, and for us to go to Texas and diminish the Great Kabuki on world-class championship wrestling, which played in major markets throughout the Carolinas, would have been bad for Jimmy Crockett's business. A few minutes after I let Ken know where we stood, the Great Kabuki pulled me aside and said, "Gary-san, maybe it makes no difference if I lose. This way, everybody happy, and better for business." I just looked at him and said, "I'm going into the dressing room to take off this three-piece suit I have on, get into my khakis and t-shirt, and then I'm going back to the hotel. Are you coming with me?" The Great Kabuki looked down at the ground and said, "I think maybe I should stay. That way Fritz won't get mad. Kabuki, if I leave this building without you, it will never be the same between us again. Gary-san, just this one time I stay." I left the sportatorium without the Great Kabuki that day, and he did the job on world-class championship wrestling, all because he didn't want heat with Fritz, since he was afraid that he would say bad things about him to Baba. Early on in my career, I learned that if you take care of your gimmick will take care of you. I always had the Great Kabuki's best interest at heart, but after that experience with him, my whole attitude about protecting and taking care of what he and I built went out the window. If he didn't want to take care of his gimmick, then why should I? Takachiho had been wrestling for 15 years as an underneath guy and a put-over guy before I chose him for the Great Kabuki. Where was Fritz when he was starving in Kansas City? Did Fritz send him money and offer him a job? No. I did. I invested $5,000 of my own money for all his outfits, and helped him become a giant star in wrestling. He was one of the hottest wrestlers that the 80s had, and he made hundreds of thousands of dollars thanks to me, including $10,000 in one night for Starrcade. I bought him his stuff. I gave him his gimmick, and I made him a major attraction in wrestling, and this was how he repaid me. After all the success we had achieved, that was the way the Great Kabuki and I ended our run. I cut him loose, and that was it for us. We had planned to go back to North Carolina and finish our program with Jimmy Valiant, in which Jimmy would beat the Great Kabuki in the Greensboro Coliseum and I would get my head shaved. However, I told Jimmy Crockett that I didn't want to do it anymore, because the Great Kabuki and I were through. Jimmy understood, and in time, surprise, surprise, the Great Kabuki went to Japan and became a gigantic star for Baba,